I work at a pizza place, mostly inside since my insurance won't cover anything if I get into an accident while delivering. But every now and then I fill in for one of the drivers because the tips can be decent. Our delivery area covers a weird mix of places, those newer upper-middle-class subdivisions where everything looks the same and the tips are usually terrible, an older neighborhood from the 40s where people are generally fine tippers, a couple of apartment complexes that always come through, a few trailer parks where it's either great or nothing at all, and then a stretch of rural homes scattered along long, quiet roads. Not see the entire galaxy at night rural, but far enough apart that you'd never hear anything from the neighbors. About a week ago, I was covering a driver's shift, and the night had been going pretty well. Most deliveries were close together and averaging $5 each. When I got back from one run, I checked the screen and saw I had a single order left, an address I didn't recognize, which was strange because we usually have the same customers ordering over and over. This one was on one of the more isolated roads, and the ticket had special instructions. I asked the kid who'd taken the call, and he said the customer told him to go around back because the front door wasn't working. Not unheard of. People paint their doors, or the frame shifts, or they're hanging out in the backyard. Nothing unusual on its own. Still, as I started driving out that way, something about it made me uneasy. I wasn't thrilled about walking behind some random house in the middle of nowhere. It wouldn't be hard for someone to order a pizza to a vacant property and then jump the delivery guy. There are plenty of abandoned houses out there. I figured I'd check the place out first, and if it looked off, call them and say it was against company rules to go behind the house. Easy enough. The further down this road I went, the thinner the houses got. By the time I got near the address, I spotted a place set back from the road that looked completely abandoned. No number, half hidden by trees, and hope to hell that wasn't it. I drove past it to check the next mailbox, and naturally, the creepy one was the right house. Great. I turned around and pulled into the driveway, and the closer I got, the worse the whole thing felt. I parked at the very end of the driveway with the back of my car still hanging out near the shoulder so anyone driving by would see it. Then I called the shop and told them I was at a house that didn't look right, and if I didn't call back in 4 or 5 minutes, they should call me. And if I didn't pick up, they should call the police. While I was talking to them, I took a better look at the place. It didn't just look neglected, it looked like no one had lived there in years. The driveway was crumbling and half overtaken by weeds. No mailbox, no garbage cans, no car, no sign of kids, nothing. The yard looked like it hadn't been mowed in years. The roof sagged, the siding was falling apart, and the deck around the back was barely holding together. Ironically, the only part of the house that looked even halfway maintained was the front door, which was supposedly broken. Every window was shut even though it was unbearably hot that day, and the ones without blinds had boards covering them. I didn't see any power lines leading to the house either. It was dusk, but there wasn't a single light inside. By then I was getting genuinely nervous. I'm a 5'10" guy around 180 pounds, not in any impressive shape, but I did karate for years, and I'm not completely helpless. Still, I avoid confrontation when I can, and lately there had been a noticeable increase in burglaries and assaults in the area, enough that this situation didn't feel like something to shrug off. I finally worked up the nerve to step out, grabbed the pizza, left my car door open, and called the number on the ticket as I started walking toward the house. The phone rang twice before an automated message came on saying the number belonged to a free texting app. We've had prank orders through those apps before, and that was a major red flag. Everything in me was telling me to turn around. But I also didn't want to get labeled as the guy who backs out of deliveries, so I stood there at the edge of the yard with the pizza in my hands, hoping whoever lived there would see me and walk out to grab it. I kept looking at the windows, and that's when I saw one of the blinds lift by the front door. A man was staring out through the gap, wearing a hat pulled low and oversized sunglasses, even though he was inside a dark room surrounded by trees. Behind him, I thought I caught the shape of someone else standing farther back, but it was hard to tell. As soon as he realized I was looking at him, he said something I couldn't hear and moved away fast, like he was heading toward the front door. I didn't stick around to see what happened next. Since I'd stayed close to my car, I only had a few steps to run. I dropped the pizza onto the passenger seat, something I never do, and threw the car into reverse so fast I grinded the gears. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and backed onto the road without even checking for traffic. Once I was moving, I glanced back and saw the outer screen door hanging open now, even though the main door was still closed. The guy wasn't outside calling out or anything. The whole place looked dead again. I pulled over farther up the road, called the shop, and told them I was fine. The people never called asking where their food was, not once, and anyone waiting on dinner usually calls within 15 minutes. That pretty much confirmed what we already suspected. We added the number and address to our no delivery list and split the pizza among ourselves. Maybe nothing would have happened to me if I'd gone around back. Maybe they just wanted to scare someone. But it didn't feel like harmless messing around. It felt like I walked right into something that could have gone bad fast. I still think the only thing that saved me was how run down and empty they left that house. If they had chosen a place that looked even halfway normal, I probably wouldn't have questioned anything until it was too late. I live in a big crowded city, and because my car has been giving me nonstop problems, and honestly because the pandemic made delivery apps way too convenient, I've gotten used to ordering food instead of driving anywhere. So the other afternoon, around 1 p.m., after spending way too long cleaning my apartment, I decided to order lunch on Uber Eats. I set the order, put on something mindless to watch, and figured I'd get my food within the usual half hour. A few minutes later, I saw that a driver had picked up the order. His name was Anthony, and according to the app, he was on a bike, had no picture, and didn't have a single delivery completed yet. At first, I didn't think anything of it. If anything, I joked to myself that I'd be his first ever customer. But then, 30 minutes passed. His little icon on the map didn't move once. I assumed maybe the app was glitching, or his phone froze, or something simple like that. I reached out to support in the chat, and after trying to contact him themselves, they reassigned the order to someone else. That's when it started feeling off. The new driver popped up in the exact same spot Anthony was in before. Same situation, on a bike, no profile picture, no prior deliveries. This time the name was Lori. I gave it another 20 minutes before sending them a message in the app, just asking if there were any issues with the order. They opened the message, never replied, and the little bike icon didn't move at all. I checked online to see if Uber Eats was having outages, but everything seemed normal. At this point, I was more annoyed and hungry than anything else, so I contacted support again. They apologized, tried to reach the second driver, got no answer, and reassigned it for a third time. And, you guessed it, the third driver was in the same exact location as the previous two. Also on a bike, also no photo, also no delivery history. The name this time was Robert. I was literally about to just cancel the order when suddenly the app jumped from waiting to pick up to on the way, and he immediately messaged me out of nowhere. "Hello, have her food. What's her phone number?" I responded saying I preferred to communicate through the app, and he messaged again right away. "What's your number? Be there in 10. How old are you?" That was the moment everything in me said nope, absolutely not. I contacted support again and asked for the order to be canceled, and they transferred me to the safety team. The woman on the phone was calm and helpful. She confirmed the order had been canceled, I'd be refunded, and she started taking down the details of what had happened. I started to relax a little while explaining everything, until I suddenly heard a man's voice right outside my front door saying, in this weird sing-song tone, "Miss Metal Gear 42069, I have your food." I don't even know how to describe the way it made my whole body go cold. The safety rep heard him too, and I remember her saying, "Is that him? The order is canceled. He shouldn't be there." I looked through the screen door, which was locked, and saw him standing there with this huge smile on his face. The second he noticed I was on the phone, the smile dropped, and he looked furious. He walked right up to the door and demanded to know who I was talking to. I told him he needed to leave, but he kept getting louder and angrier, pounding on the door and shaking the handle like he was trying to see if it would open. The woman on the phone kept asking if I was safe, and I was basically panicking at that point as I shut the heavy door and locked it. After a minute of yelling and kicking the door, he finally walked back toward the street. I finished up my call with Uber, then called the police to report him. They didn't seem too urgent about it since he technically didn't break inside, but they told me to call back if he returned. I ended up having to call again because he didn't actually leave the neighborhood. He stayed nearby for almost 20 minutes. One of my neighbors knocked on my door later to check on me. She said she'd seen the guy walk to a truck with another man sitting inside, and that the two of them were just sitting there watching people walk by, acting strange the whole time. Luckily, she was able to give the police a description of the truck and the second man. So yeah, the whole thing was incredibly unsettling, and honestly still sticks with me. I've never had anything remotely like that happen before, and I don't think I'll be using delivery apps again for a while. The idea that 3 fake drivers popped up in the same spot, and one of them still showed up at my door after the order was canceled, just freaks me out in a way I can't shrug off. I had a few friends over at my flat about a month ago. Nothing big, just drinks, music, and the usual late-night conversations that start feeling funnier the more everyone drinks. After a while, we all got hungry, so we called the nearest burger place that still delivered that late. The woman on the phone told us it would take close to an hour, which wasn't surprising on a weekend night, so we just kept hanging out. When the doorbell rang barely 20 minutes later, none of us thought it was the food. I opened it by myself, expecting maybe a neighbor or someone who hit the wrong button, but it was the delivery guy holding our order. I told him I didn't have my wallet on me and needed to run upstairs to get my friends so we could sort out the payments. Instead of waiting downstairs like most drivers do, he immediately said he'd just come up with me. I didn't think much of it at the time, mostly because I wasn't alone, and assumed he wanted to get the delivery done quickly. Once we were all gathered around him in my attic flat, we were ready to pay and grab our food, but he stalled instead of handing everything out. He started chatting like he'd been invited in for a drink. We had a movie playing, which he took as a chance to tell us this bizarre story about how he smashed his brand new TV because the remote wasn't working, and how he woke up the next day with his hands full of glass. We all kind of stared at him, unsure what to say, and eventually he stopped talking long enough to give us our bills. Before he left, he told us he wasn't actually a delivery worker. He owned the place. He said he'd always wondered who lived in the top flat and wanted to see for himself. I didn't question it because I have a pretty noticeable painting on the balcony, and a lot of people end up commenting on it. This was on a Friday. The following Monday, when I stepped out to go to work, he suddenly came jogging from the public parking area across the street. He already knew where I lived after delivering the food, and he'd apparently used that as an opportunity to wait for me that morning. He asked if I wanted to go out for coffee. Normally, I'm pretty straightforward when I'm not interested, but the idea of someone waiting outside my home like that threw me off. I told him I was running late and said he could give me his number instead. When I put it into my phone, it showed up as already saved. That's when he admitted he'd been wanting to talk to me since the first time I ever walked into his restaurant a year earlier. He said he'd been too nervous to approach me, so one day when I went to the restroom, he took my phone from my bag, added his number, and put it back before I returned. I didn't even remember the phone being out of place. After realizing I'd never text him because I had no idea his number was there, he told me he followed me after another visit so he could see where I lived. He said that when he noticed I had ordered delivery that Friday, he decided he'd bring it personally, so he'd finally have a reason to talk to me. When he saw my male friends, he assumed one of them might be my boyfriend, and almost didn't say anything. At that point, I just wanted the conversation to end, so I lied and told him one of them actually was my boyfriend. I thought that would shut things down, but instead he got angry, loudly angry. He yelled at me for several minutes about how unfair it was for me to lead him on. Then just as suddenly he cooled off and said I could always text him if I ever broke up with my boyfriend. The whole situation made me uneasy enough that I asked the neighbor on the ground floor if I could start using the back garden entrance to get into the building. That way I could come and go from a different street without passing the main door where he might be waiting. I actually did see him once at night, standing across the street near the parking lot. But from where he was standing, he wouldn't have been able to tell whether anyone was home. Last week he pulled up beside me in his car on the street near the back entrance. He claimed he was just passing by and happened to see me, though I didn't believe that for a second. I talked to him because I didn't want things to escalate, and he launched into a completely unrelated story about how he once got convicted because he drifted his car in the rain. I nodded along and walked toward the main entrance just so he wouldn't notice me avoiding it. I've spoken to the police now, and they told me to take photos of his car and call if he shows up again. Aside from that, there isn't much they can do. But the whole thing still makes my stomach tighten whenever I walk outside. Back then, I was living alone in the lower unit of a split house, the whole main floor to myself. I was working as a bartender and part-time manager at a nightclub a few blocks away, so getting home around 4 a.m. was just part of my routine. One night, after a 12-hour shift where everything seemed to go wrong, I got in, kicked off my shoes, and immediately realized how hungry I was. I didn't feel like cooking, so I ordered food, rolled a joint for later, put on something in the background, and just tried to let my brain settle after the chaos of the shift. The delivery was set to no contact, which I'd kept long after COVID, because it saved me from awkward conversations at 4 a.m, especially when I looked like someone who had been working all night. A few minutes later I heard the doorbell, but I stayed where I was, waiting for the app to send me the photo, so I'd know the food was actually at my door. It normally took seconds, but this time a few minutes passed before the picture came through. When I finally saw it, the food was sitting right against my door, exactly where it should have been. But the driver was still standing outside, right in view of my big bedroom windows. My unit faced the front of the house, the path along the side, the garbage area, everything, so I could see the entire space he was lingering in. Then he started texting me, telling me to come outside and get it. I told him he'd placed it perfectly, and I'd grab it in a minute. I wasn't going out there while he was standing there watching the door. I was in pajamas, my joint was ready on my nightstand, and I wanted exactly 0 interaction with another human being. He didn't leave. He kept texting me, and at one point I heard him talking to someone else outside, a second voice I couldn't see from my angle. That's when he started nudging my food farther away from the door, sliding the bag out of the frame of the photo spot so that I'd have to step fully into the open and around a small corner to reach it. I kept repeating myself, telling him the drop-off was fine, that I appreciated the delivery, and that I'd get it in a moment. He ignored every message. Then he started knocking, slow at first, then harder, loud enough that it echoed through the entire unit. All the while he kept talking to that other person. The longer it went on, the weirder the whole situation felt. He wasn't acting confused or lost, and he definitely didn't seem afraid of waking someone up. He knew I was awake. He knew I was right inside, and he wasn't leaving. At one point, just because I didn't know what else to do, I told him through the app that I had COVID and didn't want to expose him. Not true, but I figured it was the one thing he couldn't argue with. I watched the app mark the message as read, and within a few seconds, I saw him move the food back to its original spot by the door. Then, instead of walking back toward the front of the property like he'd come from, he walked around the side of the house toward the back parking lot. It was the first part of the entire interaction that actually made sense. He was leaving the way someone would go if they didn't want to be seen. I waited a full 15 minutes after the last sound faded. No footsteps, no voices, nothing. When I finally cracked open my door, I only opened it long enough to grab the bag and shut it again. The food was cold, my joint never got lit, and I didn't really settle down for the rest of the night. I just kept replaying all of it, trying to figure out what exactly he and the other person were waiting for, and what would have happened if I'd opened the door when he first knocked. Back when I was about 17, I worked evenings delivering pizza for this small local place in town. Most of our orders came from the rougher neighborhoods, so I got pretty used to driving through dim streets and old apartment buildings that looked like they'd been hanging on by a thread for years. One night, I had a delivery to an apartment complex I'd been to only once before, and even from the parking lot I could tell it hadn't gotten any better. The siding was stained with graffiti, chunks of it chipped away, and the stairwell windows were fogged yellow from years of indoor smoking. When I buzzed in, the door clicked instantly, and the smell of old cigarettes hit me before I even stepped inside. The customer was on the 3rd floor. I figured taking the elevator was safer than juggling 2 pizzas up the stairs, so I stepped in and got out at the top. The door I needed was cracked open a little, which wasn't unusual. People usually kept an eye out so they could pay and get on with their evening. I knocked lightly, and the door drifted open the rest of the way. An older man was standing there. He didn't look particularly odd, just a short-sleeve button-up covered in palm trees, cargo shorts, and sandals. The place behind him was a different story. The living room had magazines thrown around like someone dropped them while looking for something and never cleaned up. An old CRT TV sat flat on the carpet with its cords in a pile beside it. The only seating was a lawn chair with an overflowing ashtray next to it. He waved me in without hesitation, and for some reason I stepped inside. Normally I avoided entering homes unless there was a big order or freezing weather, and neither applied that night. I don't know if it was autopilot or politeness, but I walked straight into the kitchen before realizing it was the kind of layout that boxed you in. There were 2 long countertops running parallel, maybe a couple feet apart. Just enough space for a person to squeeze by. Overhead cupboards hung low, closing the room off from the rest of the apartment. It was basically a dead end. I set the pizzas down and turned to leave, and the man was suddenly right in front of me, his arms braced on both counters like he was casually leaning. But the way he did it made it clear he was blocking me in. I held out the debit machine, hoping he'd just pay and step aside. He took his time, staring at me the entire process, punching in the numbers one at a time like he was deliberately trying to make it slow. When he handed the machine back, I said thanks and motioned toward the narrow gap he was blocking. He didn't shift an inch. Then he said, in this low, almost coaxing tone, "You should have a slice with me, young man." I told him no, that I needed to keep moving, but he still didn't budge. My chest tightened in that slow, sinking way where you know something isn't right. So I just pushed myself sideways into his arm, and he pressed back for half a second before I shoved harder and slipped through the gap. I walked toward the front door as calmly as I could, but halfway across the living room, another door inside the apartment flew open so hard it bounced off the wall. I barely looked, just caught a blur of movement and heavy footsteps, and my body took over. I went straight into a sprint down the hall. I didn't even consider the elevator. I barreled down all 3 flights of stairs, practically skipping entire steps, and ran until I reached my car. I got inside, locked it without thinking, and tore out of the lot so fast my tires squealed. The whole drive back to the pizza shop, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Looking back, I'm convinced something was waiting to happen in that apartment, and if I hadn't pushed past him when I did, I don't know how that night would have ended. I was 17 when this happened, still living in the same quiet little village I'd grown up in. That night I'd been at a friend's place on the outskirts, just watching movies and talking about nothing in particular, and I left around 11. The walk home was long but familiar, a stretch of back roads that felt almost calming at that hour. Hardly anyone was ever out that late, maybe the occasional car, but usually it was just empty streets and the echo of my footsteps. To get home, I had to walk down a narrow road lined with a few old houses and a vicarage before it opened up into the big circular avenue where my place was. I was halfway down that smaller road when I saw this red, beat-up Micra coming toward me. At first I didn't think anything of it. But the closer it got, the slower it crept, and the driver was practically twisting himself in half trying to stare at me. There wasn't even an attempt to be subtle about it. By the time he was alongside me, he was moving so slowly the car was barely rolling, and I could feel that panic rising in a way I tried hard to ignore. I kept my eyes forward, sped up just a little, and eventually he drove off. At least I assumed he did. From there, my house was a straight 5-minute walk. I kept listening for any engine noise behind me, watching for headlights, anything. But nothing came. By the time I reached my front door, I actually felt relieved. I got inside, locked the door, and saw my mum in the living room finishing a phone call. I was trying to tell her about the weird guy in the red car when she randomly went to the window, peeked out and said, "What, that car?" I didn't even get time to process it. There was a knock at the front door. I opened it just enough to see outside, and there he was, the same man from the Micra, standing there like he'd been expecting me to answer. No pizza box, nothing in his hands, just a cap pulled low, and this strange confidence about him. He asked if I'd ordered a pizza. I told him he had the wrong house, but he stepped forward slightly and repeated the question like he wasn't really asking. Before I could react, my mum came up behind me, pushed the door open wider, and asked him if something was wrong. The change was immediate. He backed off, muttered something about the wrong address, and hurried to his car. Seconds later, he drove off down the road. My mum and I looked at each other, both trying to make sense of how he could have followed me without me noticing his car at all. We ended up checking every lock twice before sitting down, neither of us really saying what we were thinking, that he hadn't come to deliver anything, and he definitely hadn't chosen our house by mistake.